Well, welcome Duke alumni and friends to this session of the Duke Alumni Forever Learning Institute. I am Tish Futrell, the Director of Academic Engagement on the Lifelong Learning Team in the Alumni Engagement and Development. I'm thrilled to have you with us today for this session, AI, the Arts, and Literacy in a Changing Media Landscape. This is the third session in our FLI Computational Thinking series. And today we're asking, how is AI affecting writing, media, and literacy? This session explores the evolving relationship between AI and the creative world, from literature and visual art to digital literacy and knowledge access. We will have time for Q&A at the end, so feel free to drop your questions in the chat as you think of them. You will also be asked to complete a brief survey at the end of this session. To help us explore this fascinating topic today, we are joined by my colleagues, Joe Salem and Arthi Vade. Joe Salem is the Rita D. Gianardo Holloway University Librarian and Vice Provost for Library Affairs. He is responsible for the leadership and overall management of the Duke University Library Systems, one of the nation's top 10 private research libraries. He also works closely with the university's senior leadership to ensure that the library services and collections support the academic, instructional, and research needs of faculty, students, and staff across the university. Arthi Vade is the E. Blake Byrne Associate Professor of English at Duke University. She works in the field of 20th and 21st century global Anglophone literature, and she is broadly interested in the relationship between literary history, computational technologies, and internet culture. Her book, We the Platform, Contemporary Literature After Web 2.0, will be released in August 2026. And in it, she considers how technical and rhetorical shifts and formulation of the World Wide Web are shaping contemporary literature, culture, and popular literacy practices. Please join me in welcoming Joe Salem and Arthi Vade to the Forever Learning Institute. Now you're going to hear from both of our speakers today. So Arthi, please introduce yourself and share with the audience your background and current perspectives on AI, the arts, and literacy in a changing landscape, and how you came to this work.
Thank you, Tish. It's really lovely to be here with so many people from all over the country and to be here in dialogue with Joe. So my background is pretty, I think, interesting in that I came to AI recently. I was trained, for those of you who might have been English majors, as a modernist. And so my training initially took me back to the early 20th century. But as I was beginning research on my second book, I was thinking about this category of contemporary in my field. And there's been a lot of debate about when to date contemporary. How do you periodize this category? And one of the dates that's been very common is 1945, post-World War II literature. Another date that was common was 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War. But as we get into the 20th century or the 21st century and 2025, there's been some awareness of the fact that these dates, while historically important, aren't necessarily defining literature right now. And so there's been a search for thinking about what is historically specific about the 21st century. And it's a very hard thing to know, right? Because we're living through it and things are constantly changing under our feet. But the premise of my book is that one of the dates we might consider for thinking about what is contemporary about literature right now is 2004, which is the beginning of Web 2.0, which is something I'll talk about through the course of this dialogue. But basically, what we see with that is the rise of mass writing. So that means it's not just professionals, journalists, authors, scientists who are writing things now. It's all of us writing casually, informally on the web. Whether we choose to or not, we have this possibility in front of us. And I think that's changed what it means to be a literary writer today. And that is probably the biggest historical transformation that we're seeing for my field. So that's how I got into thinking about AI, because I feel like this is a kind of prefatory moment to the AI explosion. The other way is I was Duke's representative at the National Humanities Center for a national curriculum project called Responsible AI Curriculum Project. And the goal of that was to bring scientists and humanists into conversation around generative AI and to see if humanists could launch courses that would put our perspective at the center of the curriculum, since we know that scientists will already have their perspectives kind of known in this area. And so if AI is truly going to be this kind of socially transformative force, we need everyone at the table thinking about how to shape it. So to that end, I participated in this program and launched a course at Duke on AI in literature and film. And the first half of that course looked at representations of AI, the mythologies informing AI. For those of you, again, who like old things like I do, we started with the Pygmalion myth from Ovid as the first form of artificial life, a myth around building something and then falling in love with it. And then the second half of the course, we looked at contemporary writers and artists who were using generative AI tools in their work or reflecting on it critically. So the students got to look at representations and applications. Maybe I'll stop there and let Joe talk about himself.
Great. So, Joe, please introduce yourself and share your background and perspective and how your role at Duke continues to evolve with AI, the arts, and literacy in a changing media landscape.
Well, thanks, Tish, and thank you all for being here. It's really a big honor, and I'm been excited about being in conversation with Arthi for the last week or two. So I'm excited that it's finally here. I do serve as a university librarian. A little bit on my background. By default, that means that I love old things as well. It's part of the librarian's role is to preserve a lot of our history, or as much as we can at different libraries, really in service to the future. That's the way I try to think about it. And so throughout my career, we've seen libraries go through major shifts informed by major technological shifts. When I first got into this field in 2000 was my first professional librarian position. We were still dealing with the move to the internet and thinking about delivery of scholarly content, not quite yet books, but scholarly journals through a networked system, really in a hybrid kind of mindset, straddling print, really print-based. Not only collections, but the way that we thought about organizing information from a very print-based culture and mindset. And then the implementation of a lot of technologies that for the first 10 or 15 years felt like digital interpretations of analog practices. And since that 10 or 15 year period over the last decade or so, librarianship in general has felt like it's moved much more into really defining what digital means for us, while honoring and working with analog content. Nothing is going away. That's one of the challenges in our field. I like to tell people I have an 11-year-old. She'll be at a campus like Duke's in 7 or 8 years, and she will have an expectation that there is book and print culture, because that's been part of her upbringing, and she's not alone in that. So we've been hybrid and will be for quite a while. I personally come to this from a couple of different perspectives. I was an English major, and then got into librarianship, and then in my librarianship have focused on strategic planning and educational evaluation and measurement, and really a lot of teaching, which was probably unique to my time period as a frontline librarian. Most people in my role a decade or so ago probably came up through real collections-based work. But having focused on the way that the library contributes to instruction, the curriculum, the life of students in the classroom, in some ways I feel that that preparation is really uniquely prepared some of us in my generation for this moment, because as we're going to explore, one of the biggest things that we can help students and our faculty colleagues with is the critical thinking that's important in this age of AI. And how do you interpret and work with the outputs from these systems? How do you interpret and deal with bias and a lot of concepts that we've been teaching for quite a while, just not at the same scale or not at the same rate. The last thing I would mention, I come to this work within the last 5 years or so, but really accelerated since I've been at Duke. I was asked by the provost to co-lead an initiative called AI at Duke, which is a planning and prioritization effort. The library, university librarian, so me representing the libraries, we've had representation from teaching and learning and representation from the School of Medicine in the leadership roles. But then wide participation among faculty across the disciplines on this planning and prioritization effort. That has meant I've been really fortunate to be part of a lot of conversations at the university level and also within the profession of librarianship, informed by what we're doing at Duke and what our concerns are here.
Great. Well, Joe, that's actually a really good segue into my next question for you. And that is really kind of share with our audience about why you think AI fluency, and maybe on a broader level, why AI fluency is vital to the changing media landscape.
No, thank you. That's a great question. The timing of today's presentation couldn't be better. Earlier this morning, I was fortunate to give kickoff remarks for an extended engagement among the librarians around AI and their work. And today was the kickoff to that. And we talked about this already this morning a little bit, even in my kickoff remarks, and they're dealing with it as we go forward. AI fluency is probably the next step in a set of competencies or literacies that we've been challenging students to adapt to really since Arthi's point of inflection point of the Web 2.0. We'll talk a little bit later about a concept, information literacy, as part of this trend. And when you look at the Trinity curriculum, you'll see language around these kinds of competencies. Really, what we're looking and thinking about is how do we help students, especially students, but we all will benefit from this, understand how these systems work, how they were trained, on what kind of data they were trained, what biases they bring into their work, and even the way I'm talking about it, I'm making it more agentic and alive than we talk about with other kinds of systems. And understanding the output. How do you work with these systems so that you get the best output, the most verifiable output? And so this is essentially the main concepts around AI fluency. It's really tricky on how these systems work because, like a lot of current digital platforms and systems, they're kind of black boxes. So we have a sense of how they work and what they carry into the future from a data bias perspective. And what do I mean by that? Most of these systems have been trained by crawling and using the open internet as its language source. That's how it's been trained. That's how if you think about it from a human perspective, it's essentially the way that we've taught language to these systems. And so as they go, as we probably all know, really they're predictive models on what the next step in a language construction would look like as they respond to queries and interaction. That's been trained on the open internet. We know that there are issues with the open internet, especially because a lot of gated or premium information has not been part of that. But now that it's been trained, these systems have been trained to think in some ways, or at least express responses to questions from people who think. They can also be focused on specific kinds of data, and that's another part of AI fluency. In some ways, not necessarily relying on the systems as they are constructed or the open web to answer all your questions, but thinking about what information would actually be helpful in answering my question? How do I get that into this system? And then how do I verify the way that it's analyzed and worked with it? So this is a big part of what librarians have always done, especially over the last 25 years or so, but are increasingly doing as part of curricular partners and in direct service to our students.
Wow, it's just really fascinating. And you mentioned the Web 2.0, and that's just another area that we'll talk about today. So, Arthi, tell us more about the digital U and your research in literary history and the emergence of technology and Web 2.0.
Sure. And what I'm going to be saying today, I actually gave a shorter, or much longer, actually, to be truthful, version of this to our students in the Let's Talk About Digital U course, which you may have heard about if you've attended other sessions of this series. But basically, I was asked to speak about what digital U meant from my perspective as an English professor, as a writer, and as I said, the first thing I think about is Web 2.0. So I'm just going to give you a primer on that. And I'm going to share some slides from the lecture from that course to help you follow along.
Great, thank you.
Yes. So do you see it?
Yes.
Okay, great. So the first thing I'm going to actually do is go back to this slide right here, which is to explain the difference between Web 1.0 and Web 2.0. So if those of you who know, the internet is an older technology from the 60s. The World Wide Web is built atop the internet, and Web 1.0 was associated with read-only websites. So what does read-only mean? We're thinking about the 90s right now. We're thinking about websites that were more like personal pages. Um, and the people who made those websites would publish content, and then you would come and read that content. And you might browse the web in this way that retrospectively was considered static from the point of view of Web 2.0. So Web 1.0 we associate with a kind of individual web pages designed by people. And the dream of Web 1.0 was actually that everyone would be able to code their own web page in HTML. So you may have heard of Tim Berners-Lee. He's sometimes known as the inventor of the web. And he actually said, I wanted to create a mass coding environment in which people would be empowered to write and code on the web. So I have this infographic to show you the kind of unevenness between published content to be read and what we call user-generated content now, which was when a person who was reading the website might have the ability to like leave a comment or create their own writing in return. So Web 2.0 kind of this is again around 2004, it looks at Web 1.0 and says both how can we change it and how can we make money in a different way? So I think of Web 2.0 as both a business model and a social vision, and these things are very aligned. And one of the big things that were kind of articulated was one of the first principles was the web as a platform. Now, what does a platform mean? Well, from a business side, a platform is an environment in which developers can build other applications on top of the platform you provide. That's the more technical definition. The social vision is it's a place for you to express yourself, and you is every you, and everybody is invited to express themselves on the web. And so what we see is this real emphasis on user-generated content, on ordinary people coming and talking and interacting and sharing, often artistic materials online. So music sharing, file sharing is something you probably have heard of, like Napster, places like that. Now, so you can see how the web grows exponentially in this moment. And I'm just going to summarize some Web 2.0 principles really quickly. The first is free culture. And it's this principle that information should circulate freely. And I'm drawing a quote from somebody who's actually quite critical of free culture. His name is Richard Stallman. But when he talked about free software, he said, free as in speech, not as in beer, meaning we want people to not have barriers to sharing information, but it doesn't mean you can't charge people for the information. You can't make money from this. So this idea of maximum circulation is something that really informs the early free culture principles. It informs the rise of social media platforms like Facebook, like Twitter, places like that. And one of the other early principles of Web 2.0 was trust your users, meaning that these types of environments weren't going to come online fully formed. They were going to come online maybe as beta. Users are testing them, learning about them. They're going to make mistakes, and the users will catch them. The slogan "Move fast and break things" was another kind of dimension of this moment. Your users might fix your mistakes, basically. So it puts us in a position of accountability. It also puts us in a position to improve systems. So if anybody was an early adopter of Twitter, now X, you would know that Twitter adopted features based on user behavior. So people, regular people, shaped what these platforms looked like in the early days. And then the last thing is the emphasis on user-generated content. So whatever you were writing, posting, what you had for breakfast that day, the book you were reading, all of this was going to be collected. When Web 2.0 needed to monetize, what it thought about was we can monetize the data available in the user-generated content. We can monetize the behaviors of people moving through this content. And then we can predict what they both want and what advertisers, what ads we should show to them. So that was the turn to monetization. And I think from the 2004 to 2012 period, not as many people were familiar with the idea of being the product. But I think now more people know that with social media, if you're not paying for it, you are the product. Right. And then the last, maybe I'll just point this out. Our students know all these platforms very well. And so I think that this is the kind of thing that can hook them. I'm an English professor, so I'm gonna make you think about pronouns. So the digital you of Web 2.0, right? If you ever go on these platforms, you probably take for granted the prompts, but the prompts are actually something we can look at critically, right? So whenever you're prompted to write on a social media platform, it's usually addressed to you as though it's just to you personally, right? So 2004, Facebook asked you, what's on your mind? YouTube's slogan is still broadcast yourself. Instagram says, post your story. And so you could kind of have this pun on new media. Was it new media or is it new, like as in you media? And this media theorist named Wendy Chun pointed out that this you that you see ubiquitously on the internet is a kind of fictional character in the drama we call big data. Because at this point, you're thinking like, what do I think? Me as an individual. But really, this you is addressing you as just one point in a vast sea of people who need to post for these businesses to be successful. So I wanted the students to think about, what does it mean to kind of feel yourself as an individual being prompted and solicited to write in certain ways, and in a way initiated into a culture, even if you think you're the one doing it, you're not always driving the car. And then you're also being addressed as part of this huge aggregated population that on the back end of the system that you're not seeing is being put into a database, being monitored, being surveilled. And so we want to think about ourselves as individuals, of course, but also as being put into these bundles of data and being mixed in with other bundles of data and just being aware of ourselves as part of this population that's being shaped. And then from there, we could talk about the way writers and artists have responded to this new form of digital you, of being online. Thanks.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Arthi. That was just really informative. Joe, did you want to add anything to that, or do you have anything to follow up with?
I would just make one observation. The data piece of this that Arthi was talking about is well, first of all, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. This is the data on which a lot of these systems were trained. So it's really on the language submitted in a lot of open Web 2.0 platforms, all the social media we're talking about. So this is the language of the large language models for the most part. And the data themselves have just proliferated in a way that researchers, Arti among them, researchers have gotten more accustomed across the disciplines to working with mass amounts of data and analyzing mass amounts of data. And I think in many ways, systems like libraries or programs like libraries at institutions, especially at Duke, that has meant that we've had to get a lot more proficient in managing data. And now we're at a point in generative AI where these data that we manage are the lifeblood of these systems, and they're going to be lifeblood going forward. So managing them, understanding data, is so important in this world and continues to be. And it's across the disciplines. You know, as Arthi's mentioned, she's an English professor. 20 years ago, we weren't managing data at the same rate that we are in across the disciplines like we are now.
Wow. So it really is you-driven data, it sounds like, that we, the people, actually drive. So we talked a lot about the literacy and you both having your backgrounds in English and literacy. How does AI play a role in the arts? And that's a question for the both of you.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of polarization and debate about what role AI should play in the arts. So I would say that the lion's share of artists have been deeply worried about the role that AI already plays in generating images, models like DALL-E, um, in the fact that it's been trained on, most recently, there was a case that some of these models were trained on pirated data. So I think Books 3 was a data set that might have had materials from a shadow or pirate website called LibGen. So a lot of people have seen books that they wrote, trained on, they were not compensated, they never consented. And so there was recently a lawsuit, and Anthropic will be settling with a lot of writers who brought a class action suit against these AI companies. So I would say in the larger economic landscape of being an artist today, this represents another potential obstacle to compensation, or a potential way of lowering the value of information and of storytelling if it's also democratizing those skills. So I would say that is the bad news, right? This is like the big question around whether we should allow or how AI will change the creative industries. Where I think there is potential good news is when these technologies democratize access to the means of creating art, people who could not afford to create art or might not have been able to do it before find themselves in a place where they can kind of get through the gate. So, there might be, indie filmmakers who can't afford certain kinds of equipment who will make use of a model. You might see young people use a model as a gateway to actually studying more about the history of art or literature. That is certainly what I hope will happen, that these are not the end-all be-all of creativity, but they might be gateways for people who would not have had those gateways otherwise into the culture of the humanities. And then I would say that there is a subsection of writers who, from the beginning, have been early adopters and have done such really, really great, interesting things with large language models. But that work is getting harder if we don't figure out a way of kind of fair compensation and support of all artists. So I've seen, for example, in the days of GPT-3, one of the precursors to ChatGPT, artists using the model when it wasn't so smooth, wasn't so fluent, is another term we hear actually, when models speak very clearly and as though they're human, we sometimes say they're fluent. The artists that I saw working with those models were kind of trying to break up the fluency, were taking advantage of places where it seemed to be glitchy or disruptive. And they were using it to write things that I hadn't seen before. And so I felt like there was this moment where there could have been literary innovation and artistic innovation with models by humans who were still very much in charge and who weren't kind of addressing the model as a customer, but we're working collaboratively with it and thinking about it at a level that demanded more literacy than the current models that are more customer facing. Yeah.
Great. And Joe, did you want to add anything?
I would just add a real concrete example of part of what Arthi was saying at the tail end, as far as using AI technology as part of expression. This is a noteworthy large scale installation at the Kennedy Center by Rafiq Anadol. And so I'm putting a link in the chat. You can get a sense. It's a very large installation, multi-sensory installation using a lot of AI and kind of in addition to other digital media. So it has become an expressive tool, and I think tool is the most optimistic part of this. Either in the arts, you'll see some of the technology being used exactly like Arthur was saying. So I don't have to repeat it, but as a tool for people who may not have been able to otherwise, or as a point of contemplation and reflection or response. On the bad end part of it, I know we're talking specifically about the arts, but it also has an impact on scholarship and specifically scholarship in the arts and the humanities. And what I'm even more specifically thinking about, quite often, and not everyone, but quite often, the scholarship in those disciplines is longer format, book format, like Arthi's book. And quite often, one of the best partners for getting that into the scholarly discourse are places like university presses. And university presses are really challenged right now from a revenue perspective and from just the general publication upheaval. We had really good years during the pandemic when people were buying books, and then it's been leaner. And I'm saying we from the larger perspective. The press is a great partner, but does not have a formal relationship with the libraries. Libraries are really great press partners. We're seeing the opportunities for large language models to improve themselves by looking at scholarly work. And quite often, part of what the offer to press directors and to scholarly publishers is to take their published content and make it available for large language model training. This has the benefit of improving the language and the examples that it's using. Every press I know is diligent and thoughtful and will give their authors the opportunity to opt in or out depending on their model. But quite often, not every author can be as responsive. I am optimistic for where we're going with this because it can be helpful. I think it's also a challenge as more and more is published. I would anticipate that more of that scholarship will have licensing rights to be able to use in large language models. And so I think authors are going to have to pay really good attention to how their work will be used in subsequent years.
Nice. That's very important because I think, as like you mentioned, artists finding the right tools and the right balance with AI and their work and their scholarship. I'd like to close with a question for the both of you, and please, by all means, take as much time as you need to just expand upon it. But what do these current trends in AI mean for students today? Arthi?
Yeah, it's a really great question. You know, I think that it's really important that students have core skills in reading, writing. Coding is not my domain, but I do think you might hear things about coding going away, but the kind of thinking that you have to practice when you code is important. The kind of thinking you have to practice when you read and write for yourself is so important. And so my thought process is that as new technologies come along and potentially change the kinds of ordering of jobs, there will always be things that employers look for, and that will be the ability to critically adapt and creatively have ideas about the situation you're in. And to me, what I really want to see students do, and why I haven't given up the essay, for example, as a fundamental evaluative tool in my courses, despite the presence of LLMs and the potential paranoia around are they using them, is I believe you need to maintain these skills in the environment in the world you live in, right? So I think that learning the art of long form writing can be done in an age of LLMs, because knowing what constitutes good writing is how you evaluate what you're getting from an LLM, right? So I think students still need to learn that in the classroom. I think we need to really focus on reading endurance, which is to say, keeping students reading long works, chunking it in appropriate ways, but moving away, but not, moving to shorter form writing, not kind of going with the flow of where popular culture is going, but asking them to take what they know from popular culture, put it in conversation with the skills we want them to master, and know that they can still do those things. Like, I really don't like the narrative of this being the age of distraction and students having shorter attention spans. I just think we're cultivating attention in a different environment, and we still have the ability to do that.
Great. Joe?
Yeah, I agree completely. I think a couple things for our students. Just general thoughts, and Arthi, I'd love to hear what your experience has been in the classroom. I also think I'm going back to Web 2.0 for just a moment. In the library environment, I published a really brief, just focus group studies at the time on Web 2.0, and part of what we were hearing all the time was the idea of digital natives. And so, one article we wrote based on the conclusions of focus groups was that there weren't no natives no natives here was the name of the article because which needs context. It's not a great title, but we were not finding digital natives right away at the earliest outset of Web 2.0. And certainly there are now. I have an 11-year-old, as I mentioned earlier. She's not on social media, but she's a digital native. There's no doubt. I have found the assumption that students are automatically coming to Duke with a lot of AI experience. I think it's really much more nuanced and mixed than that. It is likely the case that, especially this incoming class, has more access to AI tools than they've had previously, and more robust ones with the partnership with OpenAI and the ChatGPT 5.0 access for all students, all undergrads. It's probably the case that they have tools that they haven't had before, and probably working in environments that were much more controlled as far as what AI use looked like. And so I think it's a quick transition for these students. And the more that our curriculum can engage them exactly the way Arthi's talking about it, from a realistic perspective, not from a prohibitive one, that's not going to do anything effective, but thinking about how do you use the tools effectively? How do you understand what the output looks like? And then how do you use it really well? There are components of our work that can become more efficient, where libraries work very closely with students who do things like the research paper or some kind of research assignment. It's a completely valid new way of working where you might start with a ChatGPT prompt, a well-engineered one, hopefully, but that would gather even scholarly articles and help you to understand them, or at least get the context for them. So thinking about how to implement that into the way that students work, I think is helpful and will likely carry into their professional lives. The last thing I'd say is I think we are all going to be challenged in higher ed in the coming years, because even institutions like Duke, we graduate and put into quite a few industries and different academic sectors, real leaders, thought leaders, and leaders within industry. They still go through a typical kind of entry level progression in their careers. And I think when we're seeing more and more news of this, but when we see positions either being constrained in some industries or elsewhere, it's at the entry level. And so how do we build the experiences where students will still get to those leadership positions, but not do it after the 3 to 5 year period in an entry level position? How do we bridge that and graduate into a sphere of influence, students who are ready to be leaders and to really work with the tools and the technology as it stands today? I think that's an ongoing challenge, and it's especially acute for institutions like Duke.
Joe, I just think that's so interesting, because I too have read about the pipeline problem where we have entry-level jobs going away, or we have some certain companies just enacting hiring freezes because of investment in AI. And while I hope that that will eventually smoothen out and the labor market will settle, this idea of graduating into the sphere of influence is something that I think is a really big question. Like, how does one do that? What does the curriculum look like to do that? What kind of graduate work is involved in that? Is that an undergraduate education goal? I mean, those are just, I think, open questions. Yeah.
And thankfully, we're engaging in them. When I talk
Yeah.
to our peers at other institutions, they're not, and it's not necessarily from a head in the sand. It's just that they're not probably as connected with their alums and probably enjoying the sphere of influence that we might enjoy right now.
Well, just it's so fascinating. Any final thoughts or insights before we open it up for Q&A? I've noticed there are quite a few questions already there, but if you have anything else you'd like to share before we go to our audience, please share now.
I love Q&A. I'm happy to go straight to Q&A.
Wonderful. All right, so let's see here. I will see there was a couple questions. The first question here from Ronnie is, how does one differentiate the you from from AI and other users? Let me repeat that. How does one differentiate the you from AI and other users?
Does that mean how does one know one's talking to a human, like versus a bot? Or I'm not sure if that's what the question means, but I would say the way that I come at this idea is I actually think that the you of AI is partly the we of us, right? Like Joe was saying, the the models that currently exist were trained generally on the mass writing of the open internet. And so there's a way in which that has biased the data. So we know, to be very blunt about it, that white men make up the predominant numbers of people writing on the internet. And so the data is biased in that way. Wikipedia, a huge source as well, and that has its own demographic of writers. And so we have an awareness of the ways in which the you of AI, when it's responding to a prompt, is a probabilistic output of all of us. It has been trained on us. And even if you are a person who says, I don't have a social media account, I don't write on the web, I'm not doing any of this, you might write emails, you might have ended up online via a family member's social media account. And so there's this way that I think the computational environment, the social media environment, it's so all pervasive now that even if we don't opt in, we're almost drafted in. And so that all is scraped too. If you're interested in the you, there are websites where you can even see, have you been trained on? You can go and see whether your name or your image or something you've written or a picture you have taken is in a large data set or is in a training data set. And that can tell you whether, in fact, with some detail, you can know what of your output has helped train a language model.
Thank you. Wow. I need that link.
I'll try to find it.
Please do. So I think, Joe, this may be a question for you. When you refer to the management of data sets, are you restricting your tasks to Duke University libraries content only, or are you trying to also utilize worldwide data sets?
This is a great question. Thank you for it. And by the way, the chat was really fun. I tried. There was an awful lot of input between listening, rooting to Arthi and the questions in the chat. So thank you for all that. We are not limited to Duke Library data. Part of our role, and this is a role at the institution, at most of our peer institutions, but not necessarily one played as heavily by the library, is to help manage the data that our faculty researchers, typically faculty, but also sometimes grad students, that they generate. So it is the case that we have digitized most of our library collections. That's part of data that easily could become, I think, a future here, even if in situations where the language models have been trained on other data, that curated data will be really helpful in answering most useful questions. And so you can imagine a world where someone with Arthi's interests or mine of old stuff would like to look at our digitized or use our digitized collections to answer questions. So we have those data. We also have the research data that faculty and graduate students publish as part of their work, either because they choose to or because of funding requirements. They're expected to publish it openly. And then increasingly, we purchase and license data sets that we can make available either to the Duke community or in as many cases as possible, the widest community. Earlier this year, you may remember with some of the cuts to federal agencies, there was a lot of activity where federal data was being lost, and the libraries, as part of a program called the Data Curation Network, went through and grabbed as much of that data as possible. And so we helped to host that either directly or through all these other partnerships. The last thing I'd say here is there's really great potential for Duke, since we have such good infrastructure and we really know how to do this well, to really focus on specific kinds of data. So one of the things coming out of the climate initiative is the idea that we can use the people and the infrastructure we have in place to build a climate data center. I like to call it, I would like to see it become the climate data center among our peers, but at the very least, a climate data center, perhaps focusing on certain aspects of climate data and perhaps the intersection of climate and health. And so that's part of what we're thinking as well.
Great. Thank you, Joe. So this is a question for Dr. Vade. As a fellow English professor, I'm actively embroiled in the endeavor to prevent GAI dependency to ensure students are thinking and writing on their own rather than outsourcing academic assignments to machines, especially in a course centered on AI. How do you approach the effort to curtail the reliance on such tools to generate ideas or written content?
That's a really good question. And I think it dovetails with the question that was asked earlier, where I see now in the chat, the U is about wanting to nurture and protect my own voice. And it sounds like the goal of this other professor is to also nurture and protect their students' voices. So the way I used to come at this, and I admit I came at this in the era of GPT-3 when the model was not as good as it is now and not as available to be used as a shortcut to learning, was something I called cybernetic brainstorming. So what I meant by that was I would sometimes bring the elephant into the room. So GPT-3 wasn't that well known yet. And so I gave it my midterm prompts and I said, we're going to put one of my prompts into the model and we're going to see what it produces. And so it developed a thesis based on my prompt, and the students were all initially just kind of thrilled by the magic of the quickness. And then they read it and were like, that's great. I mean, this was GPT-3, so imagine what, GPT-5 can do. But they just thought it was initially great. And then we looked at the paragraph and I said, okay, let's peer review this great essay. Yeah, it took 4 seconds, but let's peer review it. And then as they started peer reviewing that paragraph, they found all the ways it wasn't great, actually. And then said, wait a second, I think this might be simplifying a point that we talked about in class. And so in the course of looking at its output, they felt that the limits of the output, right? So that was a situation in which brainstorming with a model led to critical reflection about the output the model was giving. But you always have to get through that initial, it's easier, faster, better than anything I could have done in the same amount of time. And I think you have to teach them that not everything is supposed to go by quickly, right? Not everything is supposed to come fast. Writing is one of the slowest, most painful processes you will ever endure. But that's where the euphoria also comes in when you finish and you like what you've written and you found your voice. So one of the things we really emphasize to our students is the idea that you don't know what you say until you're in the process of saying it. You don't have the idea prior to writing. Writing is the idea. And the idea is refined over drafts and drafts. We've always done in-class writing. If that becomes more important as a result of wanting to have have an eye on the students, I think they can only benefit from more in-class time talking about writing with each other. So you might see peer review in classes where you wouldn't have seen it before. But I think that that kind of inculcation of skills should hopefully lead to students being able to, if they decide to use an LLM in their writing, being able to preserve their voice through the interaction because they're developing their voice still in a traditional way with their peers in the classroom and with their instructor.
Great. And there was a question from Lisa Radomowski, and she wrote, I'm a website creator and writer of original non-AI generated articles. If I use AI to help choose keywords and create headings for SEO, which is search engine optimization, for those of you who may not know the acronym, putting my articles into the query, is AI going to take more from my work than it wouldn't if I didn't use AI for that? Am I making my own work less valuable, training AI to do it? That's a very good question. Any takers?
Take a swing at this. Unless Arthi, I don't want to step over you.
No, you go for it.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think any interaction we have with these tools, we have to ask the same kind of question. Unfortunately, from a technical perspective, I'll say currently, like so much that a library administrator will tell you, it depends. So, in our environment now with the relationship with OpenAI, we can work with students to think about whether they are submitting documents for, exactly in this example. We have options for whether we submit them to be part of a training model or we withhold them. That's not always the case if you don't have a paid relationship with some of these models. The default is that you're submitting that content, and it's not only lessening your work, but there are real privacy concerns and real kind of sharing issues. The reason I was happy to answer this. We have content creators that we license with all the time as part of the work of the library. And they're so concerned about this, justifiably so. I don't want to mischaracterize their concerns, that in the last round of very large renewals, we had language that we couldn't actually agree to, but essentially punitive language that if any member of the Duke community were found to take their content and put it in an open AI system, that we would have to pay a very large fee, $5 million in some cases. And unpack that a little bit, not just the risk aversion or the fact that we couldn't sign on to that. They have a valid concern, especially at the time before we had relationships like we do with OpenAI, because the only option before having that relationship was to submit these things to open subscriptions, and back to the Web 2.0 model. If you're not paying for it, you are the product. And so as you submit more and more of your work in that environment, it becomes part of the model. And then most of these models have connections and they have issues with data security online. And so it's a completely valid thing to say, don't take our content and put it in this model. Whether punitive action is the way to do it going forward or not is a good question. But I think it's a big question that will continue as content. Universities are both content consumers and huge content providers. And so we're going to have to continue to dialogue on this.
Great. Did you want to add anything, Arthi?
I would just underline the point that we're getting to a place where without even federal regulation of AI, to try to opt out your content is increasingly difficult because your content might end up hoovered up or vacuumed up in ways, I mean, not through Duke, obviously, because of the contracts, but I'm talking about the way information is moving around the web, thanks to how the web was initially designed. It is built for circulation. And so one thing you might want to do is not use a Creative Commons license if that's something you have done before, because we've seen Creative Commons licenses, which are kind of hacks of copyright, result in more exposure of people's work, but also more likelihood that your work would be trained on without proper attribution if that's important to you. So I would just give that piece of advice if you're a content creator who has used Creative Commons licenses.
Yeah, I would just make one last observation. In your example, not to be so specific about your example, it sounds like you might create open content or openly accessible content on the web. And so in some ways, you might have to make the calculated decision. It's better for me to optimize for search engines and interact with the model, because really, as they scrape the web next time, it's probably going to get your content anyway, unless you can somehow protect it.
Great point.
There is
I think
somebody
we
at,
have,
oh, sorry.
go
There's
ahead.
someone at Duke right now. I think her name is Emily Wenger in the CS department, Comp Sci, who is working on a tool for artists who would like to block the bots, the scrapers. So I think there'll be some things coming down the pipe for artists who might want to prevent scraping. And some people have the literacy to do that, and that might protect your content as well.
Yeah,
Great.
Sorry to fix it. One last one. This is such an issue though. The bots themselves, and you may be seeing this in your industries, their interactions with your websites can be debilitating. We have technology in place just for the library website alone, because we have so much content through the catalog to throttle AI bots, and we had to put it in place. It slows down the experience for a regular human searcher, but if not, it gets so throttled we can't even provide access.
And I think we have time for just one last question. It's probably a question that's going to take longer than 2 minutes, but I definitely want to put it out there and maybe leave us with something to think about. But the question was, how can we address the bias in AI and include voices, stories of underrepresented communities?
Yeah, this is such an important question. So there are some movements towards data sovereignty. You see this in indigenous peoples communities, especially where, we've seen cultural heritage get copyrighted outside of the community and then monetized, and the community doesn't receive any compensation for that. So data sovereignty just means that the community that produce the data, keeps the data, and hopefully finds a way to profit from their own data. I can say that in the arts space, there have been a number of computational poets and visual artists who have addressed bias. So one poet who I think does excellent work is Lillian Yvonne Bertram, or I will put their name in the chat. Uh, so and this, I think, is a great example of what the new literacy for humanities folks might look like. Bertram recently released a poetry collection that used a large language model. And what they did was fine-tune the model on the work of Gwendolyn Brooks, a really famous African-American poet from like the 1950s, 60s onward. And in the process of creating a model called Warpland 2, based on Brooks's poetry, Sermons on the Warpland, from the Warpland, Bertram created a model that in some ways generated Brooks-like poems. But here is the crux of it. In the process of creating this data set, Bertram reread all of Brooks's poetry, found the degree to which digitization is also an issue of equity and access, and fewer Black poets have had their work digitized en masse than, say, like the canonical poets of earlier centuries. And so she did that they did that digitizing work as part of this project, thought about the kinds of biases in what is available for digitization and what has been digitized. And in the process of making that model, compared the output of the off-the-shelf GPT-3, which we're still in that mode, to Warpland. And the way that Black lives were represented via the fine-tuned model and the standard off-the-shelf model was so striking. And the juxtaposition of those outputs enabled a really great conversation in my class about how data affects output, how the person training the model and their awareness affects output, and prompts you to kind of to ask yourself, if I were to ask standard model these questions, would I be reinforcing, reproducing biases, right? So.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Joe and Arthi, for a great session, and to our audience for joining us. Thank you.